There's no moving. Oh, you got to plug it in. Got you. How y'all doing today? Excellent, excellent, excellent. We're good now? Up. Up. Don't look at these. Close your eyes. This is too early. Too early.
Keep going, keep going. One more. The other way.
I'm clicking both.
You stop.
I'm stopping.
Okay, here we go.
There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. Frederick Johnson. I represent Blank Plus. Just want to make sure we give some grounding here. Want to give thanks and praise to a beautiful day, as well as, being mindful of the indigenous ground that we're holding. To give you context, Blank Plus is an environmental equity firm. We focus on building opportunity as well as engaging with communities that are historically disenfranchised and polluted. I'm an urban planner by trade, but I studied environmental law as well. A lot of my background focuses on not only being embedded into the communities that I come from, like my own. I come from South Central Los Angeles, those that have been impacted where water is degraded, soil is degraded, air quality, so on and so forth, but also understanding how do we immerse ourselves in these communities without being extractive, and that's where the Blank Plus comes from, right? Everything that we are part of, that we add on to. We are a coalition of different planners across the country, researchers, community scientists, and cultural architects, understand how do we develop better innovative ways to be immersed into these spaces that look like our own, while also making sure that when we think about a more sustainable and just transition, that we are being partners in those spaces and not just, again, being extractive. I'm here specifically today to talk about climate action plans. The work that I do in relation to CEEJH, as of right now, is understanding how do climate action plans and toolkits be more equitable. And when we think about that, the case studies I'm going to be going over is going to be focused on the state of Maryland, then focusing more on PG County, specifically Prince George County. And then I'm going to be doing an overview of how resilience could look more holistic and develop a more intersectional solution. The review portion is going to be an inclusive collaboration, climate disaster preparedness, embedded planning again. I appreciate you. That's a typo. Baltimore County. I appreciate you. Thank you. And then we're going to end with a collective solution workshop. Let's begin. So I've worked on different action toolkits, but haven't led one specifically. A lot of the work that I did within specific toolkits focused on, again, how does urban planning and land use and zoning be best used as a tool or metric to measure the scale of solution and embedded practice. So the climate action toolkit, the definitions are here. One thing that I do want to highlight specifically is the difference between vulnerability and susceptibility. Vulnerability, as you can read the definition, the way I envision it, is something that is the physical facets of their environment, right? So someone could be vulnerable to air quality based upon them living in close proximity to a freeway, right, or a pollution center. However, the susceptibility, well, actually susceptibility is their livelihood, their diets, right? When we think about someone living in a food desert, that may be more susceptible to having high levels of cholesterol, right, or diabetes. Keeping those things in mind as we think about what is going to be needed for a more healthier environment, a more sustainable environment, are things that we're going to need to highlight. The intersectional solution piece, when we think about intersectional environmentalism, when we think about environmental justice, that's beyond just our scope, right? Understanding that at some point, there's going to be overlapping, right? When we think about housing, when we think about water insecurity, when we think about access to education, when we think about different scales of pollution, that all of those overlap, and we have to be mindful. So the first case study I wanted to go over was the climate action plan for the state of Maryland. During my due diligence, I was able to find that there were different approaches to how different entities approach climate action plans. For some of the states, and the reason why I focus just on the state of Maryland is because we're in the Mid-Atlantic space, but I looked at different states. California has a climate action plan. Louisiana has a climate action plan. Tennessee has a climate action plan. But for the states, the way they approached it was interesting to me because they focused more on the specific forms of pollution, right? So this one focused on the decrease of greenhouse gas emissions, as well as the vulnerability for disadvantaged communities. One of the solutions that they incorporated or they highlighted was how do we prioritize the advancement of polluted communities in a way that's more sustainable. And they highlighted that through workforce development. The methodology that they used was an extension of the multiple different policies that all coalesced within the Climate Action Toolkit, but also it was very much an agency-first methodology. It was the language and the way it read was, as it appeared, was to support certain political figures, and it wasn't community first. And I think that's something I also want to make sure I highlight as well. When you think about community first terminology, when you think about community first toolkit, it's extremely imperative that you do an inclusive type of model, right? The inclusion that they did use, or the inclusive practices that they did use, it wasn't, I'm trying to be nice here. The language that they incorporated wasn't highlighting what would be the best practice for residents to be, lack of better words, empowered by the knowledge that they were collecting, but instead it focused more on the physical structure of the state, right? When we think about more industries coming in, when we think about the expansion in urban sprawl, what would that look like? That was highlighted in this toolkit. Some of the findings I do want to highlight is an immediate focus within the toolkit was identifying different ways of how funding could be could be funneled into these type of applications. Since there is a growing energy sector within the state and alignment with the general comprehensive plans for multiple counties, building that infrastructure, as I read it within my research, it didn't seem like it could be, that there wasn't no course of action to show that it could be phased in, but instead it was more the practice of it, not the practice of it, the construction of the toolkit, again, focus more on the funding mechanism, right? So when we think about general plans and comprehensive plans for the state of Maryland, what does it look like when we want to prioritize a community-first model versus an industry-first model, right, or a policy-first model? Even though agencies are needed when we think about regulation as well as policing these levels of pollution, we have to be mindful that if we don't prioritize the communities being impacted, then it's a very good chance that there's going to be triggers for displacement, and there's also going to be triggers for green gentrification. So difference between that toolkit I just spoke about and the PG County toolkit is that these focus more on smart growth, green business, and residential resilience. One thing that I actually did appreciate about this toolkit is the emphasis on how land use and the expansion of communities could also degrade the level of natural air quality mitigation, right? So when we think about the scale, and we enjoy this about the state of Maryland, that there is a diversity within the level of biophilia that you have, the level of green infrastructure, natural green infrastructure. However, if that's not done with the intention of preservation as well as engagement with historically polluted communities, then you have this tendency where you have a city like Los Angeles that is now so severely urbanized that there is no green infrastructure. So the methodology that they used was the interdisciplinary working groups. There was multiple different community groups, multiple different academic institutions. Dr. Wilson was also was an influential part in making sure that this document was created. And then like I said before, the land use assessment to preserve agricultural land. The strategic zoning that was very much in depth. And if you take the time to look through the toolkit, they have these equity markers that are highlighted to talk about what could be done specifically within certain parts of the toolkit to make sure that everyone is represented and their voices are heard. The analysis portion of the toolkit spoke more to community-wide weatherization. Unlike the first toolkit I spoke about, the funding for this to be done wasn't as clear, as well as one thing that I have found out is that when we think about the different forms of solution, when we think about just transition, when we think about a more sustainable future, I can't speak about this more than enough. That is pivotal that the communities that are being impacted are at the forefront of this change, right? So even though the weatherization was highlighted, it wasn't clear what would happen if would it be affordable, right? Is it going to be too expensive for residents to now live in these spaces now that it's more sustainable? The resilient energy communities with equity considerations I already highlighted, and then the community education and infrastructure for finance support. When we are starting to be more intentional with how communities need to be more sustainable, especially within the state of Maryland, it's essential that areas that are being quote unquote improved are also very much aware of what or how they could be interacted with, right? When we think about the new levels of industry, when we think about employment, when we think about economic justice, when you're incorporating and expanding this scale, these different sectors, it's going to be, this is my personal take, it's going to be mandatory that they are leaders within these spaces, that they are employed within every scale of it, right? You can't have different sectors come into a community and they work in not just an extractive manner, but a siloed manner, right? So when we think about training, when we think about different scales of education, right? Whether it's, entry level or higher management, these industries must be implemented in a manner that's inclusive. And that's something that I didn't see intentionally stated in a lot of the toolkits. And within my research, I've also found that there is some whose responsibility is it going to be to educate community members. And that's something that I also want us to flesh out within this workshop we're going to talk about in a second. Is that something that, where would that be prioritized? When I talked about the comprehensive and general plans in the state of Maryland, I'll go back. When I talk about the general and comprehensive plans, that's a beautiful opportunity for us to be intentional about using the language saying, okay, every sector that comes in, we're going to need to have some type of target local hire program, right? We're going to have target local education programs where now if you're going to build this data center, for example, within this state, what does it look like to make sure that residents are not just, their environment is not just impeded upon, but what does it look like when they're immersed within the full process while also making sure that their health is not jeopardized as well. So this is my own personal analysis. This is beyond just the state of Maryland, the PG County Climate Action Plan, but what does it look like when you have a community first climate action plan? So focus first, something that they both did very well that in regards to toolkits I described previously is an assessment of the vulnerabilities and susceptibilities. They took the time to talk about what does it look like when the most vulnerable communities are impacted and the different scales of those vulnerabilities. Then an embedded planning practice. For those that don't know what embedded planning is, I'm an urban planner by trade. I studied at UCLA. My focus was in community enrichment, community economics, but also environmental analysis and policy. Embedded planning is when you don't plan from your desk, right? What does it look like when you're immersed in the same areas that you're going to be supporting in? And that's something that we also have to prioritize when we think about toolkits being not done in an extractive manner, but done in a collaborative manner. When we think about coalition building, when we think about making sure that our stakeholders and partners are not just present during the ideation, right, but they're also present during the implementation and in some capacity, hopefully the regulation as well. holistic resilience is a component that I came across within my urban planning practice. It's understanding that when we think about a resilient environment, it goes beyond just a physical space, right? When you think about sustainability, it goes beyond just making sure that we have solar panels on roofs or people have access to green space, but it's also considering a sustainable economy, right? When we think about resilience, it can't just be focused on stormwater mitigation. It can't just be focused on climate hazards or the mitigation of climate hazards, but it also has to think about the most vulnerable, right? And when we think about vulnerability, it's not just the, lack of better words, the two-dimensional way that it's been described on paper, but it's also understanding that people who are coming back home, who are impacted by the carceral system, right? We have to prioritize them. We have to prioritize, at UCLA, it was the most vulnerable within my community were Black pregnant women, right? How do you build a community physically that's going to prioritize their safety? And that holistic resilience, when you think about everybody being considered within these built environments, is how we, hopefully one day, cultivate a more sustainable community or sustainable environment. The methodology to get to these spaces, and some of these are highlighted from the previous examples as well as something that I incorporated. Disaster preparedness based upon geographic severity. So right, when we think about coastal communities, they're gonna have different climate action plans than ones that are more rural, right? When we think about a climate action plan in North Dakota, that's gonna look different from New Orleans, right? Especially now, since the hurricane just impacted. We have to think about more more solutions that are more proactive than reactive. Most of the time, and especially within the toolkits that I've researched thus far, is they're reviewing, there's a level of preparation for what has happened instead of making sure that the solution is an adaptive one that is continuous. The community science partner with academic institutions for quantitative and qualitative data sets. That was something that I appreciated in both toolkits I listed before, because when you have, for example, when you have entities like Bowie, like Howard, like the University of Maryland, collaborating with local community scientists on the ground that are doing that ground truthing, again, you're able to elevate a knowledge that is comprehensive and not just one-sided. And then alignment with local, state, and national policies. One thing for me to highlight, even though it doesn't pertain directly to Maryland, is that this was done fairly well in California, where I did some research as well, where there was synergy from local grassroots movements that pushed city and state policy, and then it worked in congruency, right? There are some spaces, there are some states where you'll have state policies that actually counteract local and city policy. So when you have that synergy, not only is it a streamline effect in regards to levels of funding, but there also is an opportunity to figure out, okay, now we're gonna have new sectors, new partners come into these areas at the ground, and they're gonna need permitting, right? They're going to need a certain scale of zoning. All of those should be in conjunction with not only the general and comprehensive plans that I listed before, but they also need to be done in specific plans. One of the models that I've worked on is how do you use specific plans within areas or communities that have been historically polluted, and to best regulate a certain level of, to best regulate pollution centers, right? To give an example, in Watts, California, where I did some work, is one of the most polluted communities in the state of California. There's a school called Jordan High School that shares a property line with Atlas Metals that's blowing purple smog into the school's classroom, sewage that's coming down into it's absolutely ridiculous. One of the things that we were describing, me and some other community scientists and community planners, was how do we incorporate a specific plan for the area to best regulate different pollution centers, right? The goal for this was to, once we have it on paper, it's now, lack of better words, empower residents to now do certain levels of community policing, right? Incorporating this into a toolkit allows it to be not only more than just present, but available, right? And that's the community education piece and the embedded planning piece. When you have people who have a certain level of expertise who have similar experiences, and now they're able to share that information with residents. Residents are now able to push their own vision, their own policy forward, and hopefully that's in a reflection of state and local policy as well. The analysis piece: inclusive ideation, implementation, and coalition development, and being multilingual. We understand, especially within this state and within this country, that there's a different scale of experience, right? And everyone needs an opportunity to be represented, especially within land that's going to be impacting themselves and their families. So it's historically, especially within urban planning, you see community brought in at the ideation portion, right? You see charrettes being held, you see residents being able to put Post-its on different pictures and like, okay, I would like this pocket park to look like this, I would like mixed-use zoning to be placed here. But there's no real, but once it goes into implementation and they start breaking ground, you're not seeing community present. And personally, that's a problem for me. But it's a problem for, especially when you come from areas that we come from, that's a significant problem. So, and that's the community education piece. If you're going to have sectors and developers coming into these areas and building large scale, renewable energy or, solar farms and so on and so forth, then these residents not only need to be hired, but there needs to be an opportunity for them to own it as well, right? What does it look like when we decentralize power, not away from the institution, but also within the community being concentrated? The infrastructure improvements that lead and supported by residents. Physically, it must be done, right? When we think about physical infrastructure, when we think about, I worked in Flint for some time, one of the main issues was not just the extractive of pipes that was bringing in lead-contaminated water, but there are also a lot of lead fixtures within the homes themselves, right? So when we say those improvements need to be within private homes, who should be responsible to pay for them? It can't be a resident who's already under a certain level of fiscal responsibility and financial burden. But in that same breath, we have to be more creative, right? And that's why when we think about distributive funding or redistributive justice of funding, that's another example and opportunity for that to happen. And then lastly is the community education and workforce development. Organization beyond Blake Plus that me and my mother started is called Workforce Development Center in Los Angeles. We find housing and do job development opportunities for those that are recently incarcerated. One thing specifically that I'm working on is trying to understand what does it look like for those individuals coming back home to be immersed in a sector that's going to be essential in the next 5-10 years. And there's no other sector besides renewable energy that I could think about. And this is also aligning with a project I don't think you may have heard of it, called Renewable Rikers. It's a project that's trying to shut down Rikers Island and turn it into a renewable energy farm to power the city of New York. But that can't happen if it's continuing to be a space of injustice and housing, and I'm trying my best to use polite words here, and a space of injustice and torture upon human bodies. So the community education piece, the first point is we have to educate residents. We have to educate, we also have to educate partners that are coming in, and we significantly need to educate those who are the most vulnerable, right? And these are people who are either coming from other countries that are now finding haven here, or those who are incarcerated and now coming back home and need an opportunity that is going to be permanent. So, the highlights. One thing that I wanted to highlight from the state plan is they did a very good analysis of the NADTEC disasters, which was a new word that I found out. And it's the disasters that impact large tech services, right? So an example that immediately came to mind is what usually happens in Texas, right? When you have severe weather, the power goes out. It's something that happens way too often. I have family there, and then you have people who are not even have adequate heating because their energy grid is not resilient, right? When we think about holistic resilience, that's another component of it. So disaster preparedness, that's beyond just making sure that we have the right physical infrastructure in regards to renewable energy grids and, like I said before, stormwater mitigation, but also the trickling effects, the compounded effects in regards to making sure that these communities are are not just aware of what's coming, but best could be prepared for the future. The next point, like I already highlighted, is the workforce development. I can't urge it enough within these toolkits because there is some information on it, but again, when I was reading it, I needed to be very in-depth and very intentional and permanent. So the workforce development piece is making sure that long story short, if you build in my community, there's a job for you, right? Long story short. There's no reason why you're putting $20, $30 million into a facility, but and it has the potential to contaminate my water, but there's no partnerships with local schools. There's no partnership with residents. There's no partnership with neighborhood councils, right? That you can't build in an extractive manner anymore. The holistic resilience piece, like I said before, the assessment of ecological impacts from previous actions. The difference between remediation and revitalization is something that I think needs to be highlighted more often, right? Unfortunately, the history of how urban planning has been conducted in this country does not prioritize the health of residents, especially if you look or come from a certain area, right? So when you have this marginalization around certain pollution centers, and now these spaces are within sacrifice zones, I'm using words that I may need to define. Sacrifice zones means that you're having communities in a space that's in direct proximity to a oil refinery, to a metal recycling center, right? And based upon the history of planning, these areas are the most affordable for these families, as well as, again, they have generational residents here experience generational problems. For example, Cancer Alley in Louisiana would be considered a sacrifice zone. Local, state, and national policy. So when we look at Justice 40, when we look at the Inflation Reduction Act, that was one of the first or one of the largest EJ bills to be introduced within the country. Not only did it not align with some state EJ policy, but in some states, it literally counteracted with it, where they said, we're not even going to regulate. I mean, Louisiana is another example where they said, now we're not going to be able to incorporate the civil rights cases within environmental regulatory actions, which I think is absurd, right? When you don't consider the history of residents, it's not only going to put their peace in jeopardy, but it's going to put generations of their families in jeopardy as well. At some point, we have to prioritize what this looks like, and that's why I'm excited about this workshop. Lastly, it's a sustainable future for historic residents. Unfortunately, and I can speak for my own community, when we think about improvement, when we think about sustainability, that usually comes with a price tag, right? When you think of an area that has a housing issue, right, that is not only not affordable, right, but the amenities needed for families to be present and for it to be walkable and engaged and safe, those level of improvements trigger some level of gentrification. We all heard about the story or the example of someone looking up and now there's a Whole Foods in their area, right? And that's usually like the first trigger, or a Trader Joe's, right? We think about different examples of saying, okay, there's new development coming into my community. Anti-displacement is essential when we think about climate action toolkits, because when you start incorporating and being knowledgeable of how residents and their experience is being impacted, you also have to make sure that they're able to reap the benefits of a now more sustainable environment, right? You can't just improve these spaces and say, okay, now we're in a real zero future, but it didn't look like what it was 5, 10 years ago. And unfortunately, that's just the system, that's the cycle that usually occurs, right? Where now we're going to, an area only had what was usually single-family dwellings. We're going to incorporate mixed-use housing. We're going to have green roofs and have it LEED certified, but now rent is 5 times more. It doesn't make any sense, right? So the toolkits, they looked at it from a more broad perspective, and that's why I picked a state and a local one, just so you can see the idea of where the different scales of focus were. You see at the state level, they focus more on greenhouse gas emissions. And on the city level, they looked more at how specifically urban sprawl can affect pollution, but also they looked at how land use could be a mechanism, or strategic forms of land use and zoning could be used to best mitigate different scales of pollution. So in all, this would be my ideal. This would be my ideal highlights for a toolkit if I ever needed to create one, and it could be implemented. But for the workshop, I want us to imagine this room is a city, right? Now, we can have this be a discussion. We can separate it, and each maybe 8 or one. Actually, we do half and half. This side is a county, and this side is a county, right? Within a larger state. I want you to think about what would you need to prioritize, what approach you would use based upon the one described or based upon ones within your own experience. And again, keep in mind to make sure everyone is represented and included. To give you more context about the type of city we're in a coastal community, large agricultural sector, car-dependent area, moderate income, however, there is income inequality, urbanized, and is beginning electrification of transportation. So this is a QR code. I hope it works. I hope it works. I'm gonna pray it works, because if not, we're just gonna hop in discussion. So after this slide, there's 2 other slides. This is a Mentimeter. So as you type them out, the answers are going to pop up, and we could talk about what we're discussing. The focus is what elements do we need to highlight. So to give you an example of what elements PG County incorporated, they incorporated climate leadership, community health, transition to renewable energy, clean transportation, green business development, residential resilience, justice and equity, and public engagement. You don't have to pick those. I just want you to, those are just the triggers of the thoughts, right? What would be ideal elements? Because usually within the toolkits, there's about 6 to 8 elements that they use as pillars within the document that they then develop methodology or praxis within the toolkit to give it more context. So this is a time to be in discussion. Oh, I do. I like that. There you go. Did it hurt? Not at all? Okay.
You're on the mic. The mic is hot.
Oh.
No, it didn't hurt.
facilities can range from a number of things. So if we talk about the playgrounds or whatever, everything's owned by different people, and like, but it's used for public. And then the football field, yes, the school's the main user, but I mean, I walk the track at high school in the house because it's an empty space to walk. So it can be like kind of like a public space, but like, so and the schools are owned by different privileged.
So what I'm
That
doing
makes
is
me think about housing in particular too. Vulnerable communities is part of that. It's like, I would say it's like public space. That kind of food, parks, everything that people have access to who live
Yeah, I want us to keep in mind because I also have two other slides here as well. Like, just want to make sure the elements is a piece of the toolkit, and then the next is which vulnerabilities do you think need to be prioritized? Again, they're going to overlap, right? As they should. But now think about what vulnerabilities do you want to prioritize within the toolkit. These should be about 3 to 5.
you can refresh the page. It's still one of the issues here. If you hit next, it says the presenter hasn't changed slides yet, but if you refresh the page now that you're changed slides, then you can put in your answers. No, you're good. You're good. I mean, like for us people in the audience.
Got it.
Vulnerability.
I would say we have public spaces and infrastructure in the right place. Building and like sewage, roadway, pumping, there are bills on bills at state level. You know, funding on the state level to
Does it work? Did it work for you just now? Okay. This is a.
It's still on what elements. I don't think it's on what vulnerabilities.
Is it working now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. It's my first time, y'all. There you go. We first time in it together. We all new here. There we go.
I need it. That's all.
No, I appreciate you.
Hold up, you have to come and choose 5. So we have three. But we could collectively wait.
Yeah.
No, what's the second prompt? What's the second prompt? Which one? So you gotta generalize it. We can't just be one. And we have to build on from what the transportation is. Community health, public spaces, infrastructure.
Well, I don't want to miss it.
We said healthcare. We already said healthcare.
Did we say healthcare? We did not say healthcare.
Which is.
I see you wrote it.
Thank you.
Oh, man. Billy said hi. Oh, that mic's still on. I saw CDC attack. We really in alignment. Look at you with the chocolate brown. Yeah. I said we really in alignment. Look at you with the chocolate brown. Ooh.
Which also usually bucket disabilities and elder people. Actions that we come out with, our climate, and people are going to be impacted. So how would you, they're vulnerable to, their
Because all these things
Hey, man, let me know if you need a letter of recommendation. We get you right, man. So for this last question, I want us to come back as a room because, oh, I'm sorry to cut y'all off. My apologies. For this last question, I want us to come to the room because this is something that I found out within my own experience is you have cities and counties that have their own vision of what they would like. Or let me be more specific. You have neighborhoods or communities within cities or counties that have their own vision of what they would like it to be in regards to a sustainable future, in regards to environmental equity. However, a lot of that gets missed when you put it in a city, right? Because the city has to serve a larger quantity of people, right? So as a room, now that we're coming together, of the elements that we share, I want to make sure, thank you for everybody for participating. I want to give context. So some of the elements that was discussed is sustainable energy, public spaces, nutrition, health disparities, air quality, non-displacement of residents, housing, infrastructure, agriculture, zoning and regulation. As a city, within this room, which 3 elements do you think would need to be prioritized at the highest level? Beyond just, or not even just beyond, above of what you've already discussed as a county, what 3 things do you think need to be implemented within a climate action toolkit for this city? Oh, you can put on a QR code. You can upload that. Yes.
Maybe I'm a little confused.
No problem.
I remember you mentioning that like kind of like the plan is very much like geographically specific.
Right.
So do we know what city we are? Because if it's like, let's say,
Oh, no,
talk about needs assessment, what is the EJ kind of like issue related to those so that we can then prioritize all of the things that was listed. So the coastal community is the primary geographical characteristic. Then what was one of them?
Flooding, air, public space, nutrition, health disparities is a couple, actually.
So then,
Talk to me. Am I not being clear?
I think the question is like, is it a rural area where it's agriculture, where we have like farm animals, right? Or is
Yes.
it more of an urban one where you just like, you're not worrying about any of that or something? Even if the question is like, is it going wrong or are we just thinking about resilience in a way where we're planning and thinking ahead?
I think it's more of the latter. I mean, what I envisioned for the exercise for the last question was to bring both counties together as a whole city, and then after those dialogues y'all just had, think about, okay, what do we need to prioritize beyond what we've spoken about that includes everything that you've already discussed.
Because what I think I'm hearing is what happens is within, that's the other part, is regional, right?
Exactly.
From a regional perspective. If it goes wrong in the city, it becomes rural.
Exactly.
If it goes wrong with rural, it becomes the city.
Exactly.
So it's more so, I think, from a regional perspective.
Exactly.
And I think that's the key. So it's like, if you think about urban, well, when things are going wrong here, we need that, that's why we need that agriculture part to make sure that food is still being
Right,
supplied to
right.
the rural area, but same and vice versa. If rural areas going wrong, we may need to take those people in terms of having them, be housed or be able to come and still have those same cultural.
For sure, yeah. So yeah, the practice of this exercise for this last piece is to, I mean, I was gonna share this for the end, but we can talk about it now, is realizing that even though your city, or even though your neighborhood or your community, it has its own vision or your own specific plan for what the toolkit could look like, there's a pretty good chance that the city is not only going to supersede it, right, but it's going to have its own priorities, right? So an example of this is in South Los Angeles, there was a fight for more green space, right? However, the city wanted to incorporate its own green infrastructure plan, but that came with first deforesting an area first. And then they wanted to prioritize housing before the green infrastructure. So the idea for this exercise is realizing that even though you may have your own toolkit, this is why it's so imperative that everybody's included and everybody's voice is heard, because at some point there's going to be a prioritization over industry versus a community vision.
Lack of equity. That's what we're saying.
There we go. I want us to lead, but yeah, no, we ain't got to do the Mentimeter now. So there, we already discussed it. With that, I truly appreciate all of your time. Again, Blank Plus is a national-wide organization. We do work throughout the country. One of the main things that we're focusing on doing right now is understanding how do we develop equity elements for general plans of different cities, and then partnering with them and making sure that they're incorporating inclusive models of sustainability. So thank you all for your time. I appreciate you. That was rough.
So what happened when Nipsey got murdered, man? What happened? How did that?
Are we still live streaming?
Can you discuss the
We're not live streaming? We are live streaming.
We are still live. I won't stop.
I appreciate it.